Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the second day. Money is a democratic medium. What we're going to try to do this morning is have a conversation among people who've thought a whole bunch about money. I was just talking with Jeff about how enormous this conference is, and one of the thoughts I had this morning was that when I first started working on money, it was right around the time that I met Chris. It was a really long time ago. If you'd have said then, "Oh, let's have a conference about money," and you're going to fill a room this size, it would have been a laughable statement. And I don't know how many of you also feel this way. Maybe you've always been working on money and just felt like there wasn't really a huge community of people doing it. But I think actually something has changed. So, in any case, we're going to start having this conversation. It's a little bit strange to have a panel where people aren't actually facing each other and they're trying to converse, and they're trying to converse also with a lot of you and get you into the conversation. We're going to give it a try. The panelists are Jeff Sklansky from the University of Illinois, Chicago, Scott Ferguson from the University of South Florida, Steve Marglin from Harvard from the economics department, Stefan Eich from the Society of Fellows of Princeton, and Christine Dezaun, who doesn't need an introduction here. So I think we'll get underway, and I will start by asking a question to whichever of the panelists wants to answer. We'll start talking about it. If people have things to say about this particular question, raise your hands and maybe we'll be able to get you in on this particular question. Then we'll move on to another question. It's the form is experimental, so I hope it works. And let's start. So. Talking about money as a democratic medium, one of the big questions is, where is politics in money? And Jeff recently published a book, The Sovereign of the Market, which showed that probably for 200 years, Americans really divided about the money question in overtly political terms, in terms of class, and divided on the question of how money should be designed. There's really questions of design that we've started talking about today that seem like they haven't been on the table for a long time. But today, that all seems really like an historical project. That is, the division, the clarity of division by class interests about the design of money seems to have fallen off the table, as it were. So that's the first question. And whoever wants to dive in, I'm inviting one of you to dive in.
I'll dive in. I'm gonna channel Jeff for a few minutes. So I think both class and the idea of and the dimension of design disappeared because of three blows. The first was the demise of the populist and other monetary movements in the end of the 19th century. So as some of you know, and as Jeff has written and other people have written, the populists had fascinating money design proposals. So these are the agrarian populists. They were basically under the crop lien system. They basically had to borrow when prices were high in the spring for equipment and sell when prices were low. No banks would lend to them, in part because of the structure of their alliance with merchant factors who sold to the populists, and in part under the National Banking Act. And there's an interesting kind of public-private moment. Mortgages weren't good for collateral on which farmers could borrow. So the populists went to the federal government with an idea about posting as collateral their crop in the fall, putting it in warehouses, being able to get cash when prices were low, so they could save and sell their crops when it was higher and break out of this debt peonage system. And that proposal failed. Huge mobilization, maybe the largest popular mobilization in American history, was crushed, basically. This, William Jennings Bryan's, I think, maybe put the nail in the coffin. So the first blow, I think, against class was the huge defeat of those movements. The second was, I think, the rise of a way of thinking about the market in almost the same period. So I have a quote here from Holmes. There's a great case in which, this is a case about whether speculation is legal. Christie Grain is the case that I'm thinking of. The dispute that I'm thinking of was between a bucket shop that used the prices from the Chicago Board of Trade to allow people to bet. The bucket shop was sued by the Chicago Board of Trade for using their proprietary information. And it's a great case because speculative sales, futures, were illegal. You had to contemplate, I forget the exact.
Delivery.
Contemplate, you had to actually, the only trades in which at least one party contemplated delivery were legal. And 75% of the trades done at the Chicago Board of Trades neither party contemplated delivery. They were, in fact, traders working on the margin. So you would think that someone would have sued because of these illegal trades. Nobody sued within the Chicago Board of Trade because they were a club, right? It was an exclusive club. You had to be one of the traders to be within the Chicago Board of Trade, and nobody sued. As a result of that, the Chicago Board of Trade could, over the years, created a huge market in which millions of dollars of futures were traded before anyone challenged the trade. It goes up to the Supreme Court. Holmes says, legislatures and courts generally have recognized that the natural evolutions of a complex society are to be touched only with a very cautious hand, right? Nothing natural about this. This was a club in which the market got big enough to appear to be a general market. So then Holmes says, really clearly impressed and overwhelmed with the size of this market, people will endeavor to forecast the future and to make agreements according to their prophecy. Speculation of this kind by competent men is the self-adjustment of society to the probable. Its value is well known as a means of avoiding or mitigating catastrophes, equalizing prices, and providing for periods of want. In other words, suddenly this seems like the market is a public good and a naturally emerging phenomenon, and class doesn't belong in that picture, right? And the third thing I would say is the disciplinary settlement. People yesterday talked about Jeffrey Ingham. He makes the argument, and I think we're all quite aware of this, that there was a disciplinary settlement in the 20th century between economics, which was in charge of money, and other disciplines which were in charge of other things. So I'm particularly struck by that, having done a lot of legal history. When social historians rediscovered class or started re-emphasizing class in the 70s and 80s, nobody went to money, right? Nobody even went, no one went to finance. That was for the economists. So I think that, until people like Jeff came along, nobody put together money and class, even though it was all over American history.
I have a question. I don't have expertise here, but I guess my follow-up question is, what can we say about the history? There we go. Sorry. So I don't have expertise in this area per se, but I have a follow-up question for the group and for the room. I'm wondering, we're asking questions about the relationship between class and money and politics and democracy. What I'm wondering is, what's the historicity, the shifting historicity of class itself as an identity formation, as a way of mobilizing, right? So, and I think America has a very, and especially in the last 40 years, has we've essentially been declassed, in certain ways, at least as an ideological project. Whether that's actually happened, I think, is up for grabs. But I'm curious if anybody has anything to say about that. Class as its own history, and then how that interacts with the money question and the question of politicizing money's design.
Do you want
Sure. When I'm,
I think now you have
okay. Early Americans, I think, treated questions about monetary design as intrinsically linked, not loud enough, as intrinsically linked to questions about the exploitation of labor. And that persists for a couple of hundred years. The labor question and the money question are joined as flip sides of a single coin. And even language, labor and capital, often refers to returns to work and returns to money. And that's true. They use the term class, but the populists referred to the producing classes, for example. Monetary reform in the Jacksonian period was associated with the working men's movement. But my sense is that long before the rise of a propertyless wage workforce, ideas, new modes of exploitation that were based on control of currency and credit drew new lines of social solidarity and social conflict. That continues long after the development of a large propertyless wage workforce and long after Americans come to accept, in many ways, being paid for their labor and paying for their subsistence. They continue to treat the means of payment as an open, urgent question. So to me, there's something powerful and valuable about that linkage. And I think that there are ideological reasons for its decline, which I think Chris has already alluded to, partly lying in defeats of systemic alternatives and partly lying in what happens to popular economic theory in general. But my sense is that there's a basic truth that lay in what early Americans recognized, and it's a truth that chartalist theory of money in some ways gets at, which is that the basis of money lies in part in the authority of ruling classes to exact tolls and taxes and tributes, and then determine the means of discharging those debts, and also to determine the means of obtaining those means of payment. The power to tax is linked to the power to require people to labor in certain ways in order to get the means of paying the taxes. It's a lesson that Alexander Hamilton understood very well at the time of the Whiskey Rebellion. My sense is that that's a continuing truth. But what Chris said, and it goes also to what Scott was referring to, I think is quite true, which is that let's say earlier historians of capitalism, that is the social history of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were very concerned with class relations, and they understood that in terms of a narrative of proletarianization that thought about class in terms of the creation of a propertyless and legally free workforce dependent mainly on the job market and the wage contract. And in that story, the social relations of production of money were largely marginal. So my sense is that today, in all kinds of hugely enlivening and fostering ways that this conference manifests, we're recognizing that understanding of class relations in the social history of the 60s and 70s and 80s made certain things visible the employment relation visible, it didn't tend to, it made marginal or harder to understand some of the ways, for example, that workers found themselves subject to the power of credit and debt in recent years. And it also made marginal and less visible earlier examples of the power that control over money confers in terms of power over labor, sharecropping, the cropline system, like Chris said. So my sense is that today, more than ever, we need to come to terms with the ways in which we need to come to terms with the relationship between capital, especially in its most abstract and financialized form, and the exploitation of labor. And it came out a couple of times yesterday, I think, in comments when there was a question about how can money be democratized if workers mainly receive money as wages. Or there was another question, I think it was from Eli Cook, about isn't financialization in some ways the consequence of inequality that may derive from the rise of a growing pool of surplus capital looking for speculative investment as well as growing workers' debt? So I think that today we need to come to terms with the ways in which bankers and bondholders and brokers are able to command the labor of a very far-flung capitalist workforce that they don't directly employ. And that's why, to my mind, it's important for us in talking about the history of finance to find ways to connect that history to a labor history and a history of labor exploitation. So.
Jennifer, tell us something.
Please.
Hi. So I want to go back to something Chris said earlier, and as to say I'm neither an economic historian or a feminist theorist. However, I wonder whether, to the extent we think about money more broadly, not just the architecture of money, but also money and credit as money, whether there are feminist historians and theorists who prior to the 60s and 70s always understood class, at least in terms of gender, is linked to lack of subordination of women is linked to lack of access to credit. So I wonder whether, I mean, I haven't looked into this history, but I've been using, about doing a piece on feminist theory of finance to kind of look at these questions to see maybe that this is an unexplored area where things weren't just sort of, money wasn't just left to the economists, but maybe there were feminist theorists who were looking at this as a democratic issue.
That's a good question.
So, take another couple.
I don't know. Yeah.
Perry.
So I want to take off from Chris said that disciplinary settlement left economics in charge of money. In fact, there was, and I've written about the disputes within economics about money. So that wasn't the end of the story. It was left to economics. And in particular, these disputes came to the fore at the founding of the central bank.
Is that what you're asking for?
Bravo. So now I don't have to speak so loud. So I was, maybe I'll just start over a little bit, that the economics is in charge of money, as Chris said. Let's just, I'll accept that, although I think it could be disputed a little bit.
I mean, we don't accept it.
And that but that's not the end of the story, because there's dispute within economics. And I just want to bring to your attention a little bit about that. This was the subject of my first book called The Money Interest and the Public Interest, which was, and I would write that book differently today because I know more, but I think the thing that got it all going was the creation of a central bank in 1913. Okay, it's important to realize that this period that Jeffrey's talking about, is a very different kind of banking system than is then being established. And there's a big fight about the creation of the Fed, and I don't want to go into that, but that's where all of these different interests come up. And then the economy, and then it exists, and the question is what to do about it. And so there are economists who are kind of borrowing ideas from Europe. It's like they have central banks. I guess they know what to do with a central bank. And
then there's dispute about what would an American central bank kind of look like. And here's where the American institutionalists, okay, are playing a role. The American institutionalists, it's important to appreciate, come out of this Deweyan pragmatism kind of, this is the form that progressivism takes in the economics profession. And the people that I write my book about are three generations: Alan Young, Alvin Hansen, and Ed Shaw, and they are talking to the Fed. Alan Young is a professor here in the 20s at Harvard, but he's an advisor to the Board of Governors, to the New York Fed, when they're trying to figure out what are we going to do with this Fed thing that we've created in the 20s. And Hansen is sort of here too, as an American Keynesian, very different from the British Keynesian. What are we going to do with the Fed because of the Depression? And how are we, and he's advising the Board of Governors. So there's a live tradition inside economics to try to figure out what would the public interest demand of us. So that's an attempt to rise above class. That the institutions are all like that. Marx is not appropriate for America. There's a public interest that we must identify that is general. And that tradition is basically dead. Okay, today, and it was killed because it was successful. They all ran the New Deal, and they didn't go back to academia.
Who shall I pass it?
Pick someone. Pick someone. Right next to you.
Thank you.
And then we'll.
In regards to exploitation, Jeffrey, this is a question for you. I am curious to know about capital in regards to the prison industrial complex, because you talk about the 70s and the 80s, and I really think that that's America's new form of capital now in regards to exploiting that labor in the prison system. And I am also curious to know about what happened in the 80s and the 90s going into now in regards to that. So.
Okay, so we're going to hold off on more comments.
Do you want to let him answer? Jeff,
Yeah, you want to answer any of these things? Not an absolute must, it's certainly a possibility.
I'm willing to, although I'm concerned about taking too much time from
They don't have something burning
the rest
to say?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'll say something very quickly. It's a very quick response to Perry. I think we can have general interest and class, that these are not mutually exclusive.
I also want to say something about the question about the prison system. I mean, I think part of what's going on there is an escalation of both, sort of deregulation on one side and suppression of people's liberty on another that was in some ways channeled through the market, right? The idea of privatization, we can actually build private prisons, we can create an industry of imprisonment that was some kind of pathology of this fantasy of that focused on the market as ordering our relations. So I think it's a really interesting dimension to bring into the discussion here.
And of course, I think it bears some relation to the fate of the welfare state. Bears some relation also to the. Can you hear me? I was just saying, I think what Chris was saying also bears some relation to the fate of the welfare state, that a certain political economy of the post-war era that's predicated on sustaining broad-based consumer demand is critically weakened with the financialization of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the vast growth of the heavily racialized prison industrial complex in part goes along with declines in public education and declines in other kinds of social services.
So this, there's a very interesting thing about historicity. The move from populism to progressivism is really one that changes the way people do activism in politics, but it's also linked to, to that big shift in economics from something that looked like political economy, where people thought really of wages, rents, and profits are different interests, and they're not compatible, as opposed to thinking the way progressives did, as that economics could speak for an entire society. I think it's something that for historians and progressive historians became so obvious that was the perspective to write from. So when you get to Hofstadter or people like that, the populists look crazy, right? It's a paranoid style. It becomes just off the wall, and I think that is one of the ways that this sense of taking class out just gets very deep in our consciousnesses, the way we're educated. But I think that one of the things that's interesting about a conference like this, and the work that a lot of people here have been doing lately, is that we sort of now assume, or at least argue a lot, that we want politics back in the discussion, and we mean a lot of different things when we say politics. And so sometimes we think expertise has extinguished politics, and what we would like to do is actually challenge expertise with political insights or with political morality. And I think a lot of people here have done work like that, and lately, whether they've been looking at Europe or whether they've been looking at the United States, they're a little less sure that their critique of expertise is something they really want to hold on to, because they find that they have strange allies. And so I think that is actually something that is, I'd like to hear what some of you might have to say about that. Is there a way that we can think about expertise positively without giving up on politics? Steve, please.
Jerry Epstein. Mike, can you hear me now? Yes. Great. Jerry Epstein raised yesterday the question of the independence of the central bank and said that was a relevant topic for this conference. And I couldn't agree more. In fact, I can't think of anything which is more cutting edge in the year 2018 than this question in the context of democracy and money. The argument for an independent central bank is that the Board of Governors or the Federal Open Market Committee is a group of wise, experienced, disinterested, non-political men and women possessed of an important and relevant skill set. Sort of think of like the Supreme Court, non-political. Against this view is that the decisions that the Fed makes, particularly about employment and price stability, growth and price stability, are eminently political, involving indeed different class interests. Main Street's interest is not Wall Street's interest. And under those circumstances, by kind of standard arguments about what should be delegated to technical expert boards and what should not, the case for an independent central bank seems a little bit weak. The counter to that, and I've been reading recently Paul Tucker's Unelected Power, which goes, it's a thick book and it's really about central banking, but he wants to put it in a more general context. And he's aware of all the issues, but he finesses the issue the key issue by arguing that basically the decisions that I just said were political are not political. Why are they not political? Because ultimately there's no conflict between price stability and employment. Indeed, the other way around. Price stability is the precondition for high employment and continued growth. That is indeed the position of the mainstream of the economics profession. But I would remind my economist colleagues that Just as Oliver Wendell Holmes, once again, said in dissent in Lochner v. New York that the Constitution of the United States does not enact Herbert Spencer's social statics. The governing laws of the United States do not enact Greg Mankiw's principles of economics. There are alternative views. They do not get much voice in the economics profession. Shameless Commerce Division, a book that I thought that I started to write in the immediate aftermath of Lehman Brothers, indeed that same day when Lehman Brothers crashed, because it occurred to me that indeed there would be a market, people would be interested in what Keynes had to say. I thought this was going to be a matter of a year or two. It took me 2-3 years to really figure out what Keynes had to say and what he got right and what he got wrong. It's a book that's taken 10 years. Its title, you probably want to jot that down, Raising Keynes, a General Theory for the 21st Century. It takes a very different position and says that, I won't lay out the theory, don't worry, but it says there is indeed a long-run conflict between price stability and employment, and therefore, to my mind, undercuts the basic argument for an independent central bank. Fast forward. That'd be the end of the conversation. That'd be the end of my presentation if we were in the year 2015. We're not in the year 2015, we're in the year 2018. And I think we have to rethink not only the independence of the central bank, but a lot more about what democracy means and what democratic control and interaction between legislators and experts. You don't have to look very far or look at the headlines from a long time ago. Just last week, if you look at American politics, what's going on, if you look at chaos in British politics, you don't like those two, cross the channel, look at France. We have a very divided polity, and it's no longer clear to me, as it was for almost, I'd say I started raising these questions, I have to tell you, when I was an undergraduate, and that was eons ago. I'm a contemporary, actually, of John Harvard. We were classmates. I've been at this a long time and raising this question, but I don't think I have an answer anymore. And I think it is a question, but I think it is a question that this conference has to debate if we are really want to come to grips with democracy and money. Thank you.
That was, I think, very important. Can I just add a note that takes us back to where Chris started us off and the question that Roy raised about class? Because it seems like one thing that is in the air of the conference, and I didn't hear much about it yesterday, was the financial crisis. So it seems like that is the one event that can account for why we're all here and why something has changed in the overall conversation and the interest about money. And so the disinterest and the kind of opposition that many of you encountered beforehand seems to have something to do with the dominance of the narrative of the Great Moderation and the failure of that narrative in the crisis, and the recognition that not only are some of these decisions made by central bankers of eminent political consequence, but even more importantly, the realm of discretion was vaster than anyone had anticipated. These were supposed to be delegated, rule-following technocrats, and instead it turned out they had extraordinary discretion to do one thing or another, and no accountability for this kind of discretion. So I think it's the breakdown of the there is no alternative, there is no discretion narrative, that it counts for the politics flooding back in. And in some way, if changes in markets and changes in monetary policy account for the class politics falling away, I think it stands to be reasoned that the return of politics will lead to the reformation of political interests and parties along monetary lines. And looking at Europe, this is already happening. There's several parties that initially at least were formed with a singular monetary objective, even if they then turn into other political questions. So in some way, it might no longer be along lines of class, but there will be parties asking for specific monetary solutions one way or another.
I just want to follow up on that and, in a way, tie it to the conference even more closely, because I think part of the problem with monetary politics is that the architecture of the current system puts us in the box that Steve articulated, right? Is politics... Is a progressive politics, for example, a politics that's worried about employment, is that politics limited to pushing for fiscal stimulus? Or I mean, is that the only axis along which politics can happen, in which case we run into Trump and we understand the classic problem of putting politicians in charge of the monetary system? So the connection that I want to draw is, I think that's a trap. And I think the way to pick up on what Stefan says is to think about the monetary architecture very broadly and think about the different ways to see design decisions all over the place, so that the answer is not necessarily that we grab the mic from the central bankers and step on the gas pedal. It's that we're thinking about the architecture of money creation very broadly and trying to figure out how we can create more accountability using that entire architecture.
And that means expertise.
That means expertise.
But it's a different ethos
Yes.
of expertise, right? So we don't want to throw out expertise. We want to respond to climate change, and we want to have people who know about it and can tell us how to do it. So yeah, to me, we of course cannot throw out the expertise, with the bathwater, as it were.
I just would. Sorry. I think we're undoubtedly living in a crisis of democracy. And I appreciate the fact that the conference theme is democracy and money. My own sense is the crisis of democracy should lead us not to a flight to our own alternative, undemocratic institutions, which I think, because I think actually we're suffering today not really from an excess of democracy, but from a paucity and shallowness of democracy. So in terms of the money, even in electoral terms, of course, the electoral system can be undemocratic, let alone in broader terms of equal access to resources and rights. But I think we should be thinking about financial, monetary democracy, not just in terms of the relation between government, elected officials, and private institutions, but democracy within all of those institutions. The meaning of industrial democracy was not government control over industry. It was democratizing the workplace. And I think something similar can and ought to be said about democratizing finance.
So let's take a couple of comments. Please.
The comment about the question about taking back from the central bank the authority to where? To the government or to the public? And my question has to do with the difference between the public and the government. For example, in arguing with friends about a public bank in Illinois, the question is immediately, you mean you're going to trust the politicians with the bank? And so the assumption is that the public equals politicians, equals government, equals bureaucracy, equals all of the things that are not working and that can get in the hands of people like Trump. However, my own effort to try to respond to that is to make a distinction between the public and government, which is one of the things that's become conflated by neoliberalism. they have equated the public with government. And so part of the challenge of bringing politics back into, money back into politics and vice versa, is not only rethinking democracy, but it's rethinking or reclaiming our concept of the public. Air is public, but it's not, the government doesn't control air. So how do we talk about it? Yet. How do we talk about the public? I'm part of the people's lobby, and the people is also this equivocal term, because populism in the last 2 years of this election, or prior to the election, the media doesn't seem to be able to distinguish between an inclusive populism and an exclusive populism, and so on. So my questions have to do with the word public.
Thank you very much. Just following on from the previous question, can I ask if the panel could consider turning the question around the other way? So, if you consider that, and Steve and I were talking about this earlier, if you consider that theoretically the outcome of the design of money should, in order to be rational, be the part of a political process. However, there's extreme anxiety about the political process we actually have and its capacity to generate rationality. Therefore, isn't the question we then face the one of where can we find insight and wisdom around what order of rational politics in what contexts would render individuals orientating themselves toward representative institutions capable of making rational decisions around which set of interests represent their view on monetary design. So thus, some level of federalization, be it within the architecture of the euro, which has some level of this built into it, or a return to the notion of the multiple monies of medieval and early modern Europe, where people were very able to have different units of trade and units of account and manage the differences between those. But what political system, what form of federalism would create local rationalities that would then aggregate as a truly rational system?
Let's take one more.
I noticed nobody wants to take a question.
Yeah, this question I had earlier, I think it's running through underneath this panel quite a bit, which is about who is the working class, in the sense of, like, I think we're thinking in terms of a manufacturing, laboring class in opposition to a set of capitalists, and I think it's pretty clear, particularly with financialization in 2008, that the working class doesn't look the same anymore, and so we might frame this in terms of the future of work, but that in terms of, like, financial people on Wall Street commanding labor, actually when they're repackaging mortgage, that's not what they're doing. And so who we think of as being in the working class, and you could think of this in Marxian terms in the sense of, like, the proletariat is expanding and members of the bourgeoisie are falling into it. You certainly don't have to conceptualize it again in that way. You can think about the future of work, the point that we can no longer identify the working class as people who are engaged in manufacturing. And I think that kind of definitional question is really implicit here, is really crucial in terms of thinking about the politics of financialization of the central bank, of who kind of, what's money going to look like, who is it serving?
Okay, so anybody want to respond to something? No? Take another one or two comments on this and then move on, or move on?
We'll respond.
Okay, please. That was you.
At the risk of speaking in a conference of historians and legal professionals, I want to raise the question of the nature of our Constitution of 1787. Wasn't it itself a compromise to centralize authority, to protect property, to assure growth in a tight federalist elite? And so when we today casually use the term democracy, can't we put that back in an institutional historical context? What sort of democracy did we ever have? And what is the possibility now?
Bob?
So just a quick thought on the relation between money and democracy that I think might give us a kind of a summit from which to critique deficiencies in the distribution of access to credit on the one hand and in democracy itself on the other. So if you look at a simple bank transaction, which sounds like an unlikely place to begin, it has, I think, a very interesting legal microstructure that has sort of interesting macro consequences or significance. So if you, of course, take out a loan from a bank, what you're doing is, in a sense, engaging in a kind of a swap transaction, right? You're swapping your own promissory note temporarily for Fed promissory notes. Now that suggests to me that what money is, at least in a sovereign polity that issues its own currency, it's essentially a way, it's a form of universally tradable claim on the one hand, and of course, anything that's a promissory obligation includes a claim on the one side and a liability on the other, right? So it's sort of both at once. So a sovereignly issued money is a kind of universally tradable claim that people can temporarily trade their individual non-tradable claims for, right? If that's the case, then that would suggest that what money in a sovereign polity is all about, or in a democratic polity is all about, is it's essentially a kind of a facility. It's a facility that we're trying to extend to all of the citizens to enable them, in effect to sort of universalize temporarily their own creditworthiness, and then presumably produce on that basis, right? On the basis of using the resources that they have temporary claims to when they have this money. That suggests to me that insofar as there's an unequal distribution of access to money or unequal distribution of access to credit, that's a deficiency in democracy, in our democracy itself, right? It's a clear-cut sign that we're not truly democratic. And that takes me to the final point in connection with what you just said. I mean, people who talk about democratizing central banking or democratizing the Fed, oftentimes it seems to me aren't thinking about what the alternative to what we have now is. If anybody thinks that John Boehner in 2011 was more representative of the American public than Ben Bernanke was, and that therefore it would have been more democratic to give the US Congress control over monetary policy, I think they're sorely mistaken. If you want to democratize the Fed, you should start with democratizing Congress. It's not democratic now.
I think that's an advertisement for the next panel as well. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. So, do you guys want to respond, or or maybe we should switch gears a little bit? No, that was an internal consultation.
Off mic.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna go on a little bit. I do want to just warn ourselves. I want to warn myself about something that I too often do, and it relates to Bob's last point. There's been a politics of critique of expertise that has been voiced for a long time, and I think a lot of people. I think I tended not to take it all that seriously because it came from people like Rand Paul, and that is that when it came from the direction that I didn't take seriously, I think I thought my critique of quieting the politics of the Fed was different from his. I'm less sure, and I think we should be worried about that, about our confidence about how different those are. But in any case, maybe we can, Steve, before and then we'll switch gears.
I just want to express a little bit of surprise that, I know that there are many of you who've thought about these issues. Many of you have thought about the issues of the independence of the Fed, the democratic deficit in our legislative institutions, etc. But I'm surprised that more of you didn't speak up.
Well, I didn't give them the opportunity. There were a lot of hands. So, to their credit.
All at once.
To their credit. Well, I think we want to talk about a couple of other things as well. So,
can I respond to Bob's comment? I appreciate it. Everything that you said. Although something that I'm trying to work with and think through in my own work, are the limits of, well, the limits of our language for making sense of money and monetary relationships. And this is quite a provocation on my part, but I think that there's a paucity in our language when we reduce what we do with money primarily to exchange or to trade, which paints the picture of this kind of located dyad or triad, usually a dyad. And I think that this has a kind of residual micro foundation built into it that I think Chris and Chris's and other critiques of the barter origin story point us away from. And I think that thinking in terms of kind of multiple levels of provisioning and getting tickets, taxes and tickets, and redemption at those multiple levels, I think is maybe this isn't going to be this isn't going to catch on with the populace, but at least at the level of critical thinking and theoretical thinking, I think it's important to move us away from the language of trade and exchange. When I go to Target to buy toilet paper for my household, and I bring in my university debit card, and I pick the toilet paper off the shelf, and I bring it to the cash register, and I give my credit card, and it's scanned, and I have a nice interaction with the person at the cash register, and then I go home. I don't think that what I'm doing is exchanging. I'm not really exchanging.
It's an exchange, of course it is.
Okay.
It would be money without an exchange.
Okay. So I think I'm redeeming these units at a site of.
The redemption is the exchange.
Okay.
Anyway,
but I want to pick up Scott's point, right? Because every monetary system I've looked at has a core that's made by authorities for public use. Granted, we really have to be careful about the way we're using public, but whether it's the Bank of England, whether it's 1694, and we're looking at the beginning of the Bank of England, and William is raising for war, or whether we're looking at the American colonies and legislatures are trying to expand their own power. And in each of those systems, there's then a way of expanding the money supply for private demand. So if we think of a kind of public demand, an element of public demand, in each of those systems there are ways in which the money can be expanded or supplemented for private use. So in the Middle Ages, you could buy coin at the mint, literally. So there's a fiscal minimum amount of coin that circulates because the sovereign is taxing it in, but then you could buy coin at the mint. And in the American colonies, they start land banks because issue for military purposes and other public purposes isn't enough. For in the modern world, we have base money for that's not only to provide a base for commerce, it's also to provide for public welfare. And then the number of accounts that I could count on. I can't think of any that actually articulate. Every time you look at histories of money, theories of money, not only bias, but the frame is entirely on private exchange, when in fact money's made for public purposes as well as private purposes. So I don't think the question is whether the toilet paper is exchanged or not. I think the question is the paradigm. The paradigm is all about individuated exchange when that's only one of the uses. Granted, we need an account of the money that's created for private use and for which there's a great demand. But there's
needed for private exchange, right?
But it's also needed for public reasons, right? So that's what I'm resisting. I'm resisting even the chartalist tendency to say money's made because we need, for private use. Money's made for public reasons as well as private exchange. And that's where I think Scott's question about the language is imperative. So it really does orient our brains if we only have the exchange language.
So this is actually an opening onto a shift, right? Because one of the things we've been doing up to now, I think, is really thinking primarily about the institutional makeup and design, and that's why we're talking about banking. But there's something about money, and Scott raised this in the issue of language in the first place, that is that does something to the way we interact with each other, regardless of, that is, without focusing on the institutional structure, right? And so if we can think about, so in Stefan's work on Aristotle, thinking about if you have the proper kind of money, it will generate the right kinds of relationships among people, or it will thrive on the right kinds of relationships among people, whereas if your money is too oriented toward wealth getting, then you're likely to get the wrong kinds of relationships with people. And I think Scott's work does some of this kind of thing as well, that is thinking about a politics of care through money. So this is a sort of different place to look about what we care about when we start generating a language about money. And so I'd love for you to say something about that.
I mean, it's actually the perfect segue to Chris and Scott's emphasis on language. Because what's striking to me as a political theorist is our lack of a common language to talk about money. And this was a perfect example of a breakdown of people essentially agreeing, but struggling to kind of put in a language that allows us to actually think democratically together about a shared public institution with many private users, but a shared public institution in the first place. And so the way I look at this, and going into the history of political thought is only one way, but I really think of money being in the sense of Michel Alieta and André Alliand suspended somewhere between violence and trust, like most other political institutions. And language is essential for working through that tension democratically. And to kind of respond more directly to the question about Aristotle, I was struck by the way in which the history of political thought in relationship to money accumulates in crises. It's in monetary crises that people return to previous texts, realize the paucity of their own language, and think about mobilizing kind of linguistic resources to better capture the trust element that had just evaporated. And that can be through redemption, it can be through a rethinking of what exchange means, it can be, in the case of Aristotle, of thinking through what is embedded in the Greek word for coinage, numisma, with all its resonance of nomos, law, collective sacrifice, shared belief systems. It can be through attention of reciprocity, the way in which monetary exchange is not a dyad, but embedded in a dense reciprocal web that stretches across society and requires, as Bob said, to be stretched out equally if we think we're living in an equal society. So this is the way in which I've looked at the history of political thought in search for better linguistic resources that can help us grapple with the lack of trust in politics and money today.
People are very excited.
Okay, great. Jami.
So I want to pick up on two themes over here. One is the question of language, and the other one is the question of central bank independence. And I think that one theme that's not really come up here is fascism, the politics of fascism. And I think this is really important because, Stefan, I think you mentioned European some European parties. Well, some of those European parties are the French National Front and the UK Independence Party. And they do have a critique of central bank independence. And so I think that the use of that language to critique central bank independence and neoliberalism, but tying it to fascism, I mean, this is, there was this whole Adolf Hitler's policymakers adopted Keynes. So I think we need to be really careful in not sort of saying that, well, a critique of monetarism and central bank independence necessarily implies anything politically. That depends on other issues. Yeah, I just wanted to flag this particular question.
We've heard a lot about central bank independence. I'm a central banker, European central banker. I'm not sure that abandoning it would be a good idea to make it more democratic. I would be worried about what alternative we have. On the other hand, there is another way to make it more democratic, because a pendant of independence is accountability. So the question is how the central bank is creating money and making it accountable for that, and how it's pursuing its mandate. Let me give you 2 examples. The central bank, the way the money is created shapes the whole monetary system. So when the central bank accepts collateral, which is based on real estate, say, that has a very different impact on the economy than if the central bank accepts commercial paper between firms, encourages trade credit, because it would accept claims between firms, which is the way that central banking was doing before the introduction of the euro in Europe for a large part. So if we think about the financialization that we have now, a lot of it has to do with the way central banks create money in the first place. So I think the fight should be rather on that dimension, not abandon central bank independence, but question the central bank on the way that it shapes the monetary system. Another example, take the objective, price stability objective. How is simply the personal consumer expenditure measured? It's measured with weights, which are giving much more, which are much larger for the wealthier people, because the consumer price expenditure, or the CPI in Europe, will be with weights that are according to the consumption of goods, right? The volume of consumption. So it's a weighted average of the volumes of consumptions times the prices of this. It's a very different outcome if you look at one voice for one person, for one consumer. Then you would weigh a lot more those who consume much less, but who have constrained expenses, especially on housing, heating, and so on, all the things which are all the time more expensive.
How about? Okay.
I want to get back to Stefan's point about why this emerges now after the financial crisis. And I want to extend that question to whether it was just the financial crisis as an economic event, or one is a fundamentally political one that's motivating this. Because what really happened in the financial crisis wasn't just a crisis of the economy. It was a fundamental revealing of what the limits of sovereignty were. The idea of state sovereignty as a non-hierarchical system, or even as a coherent system across territories, was absolutely shattered by it. Both because of the classic story Perry likes to tell about the idea of swap lines kind of enforcing the natural hierarchy, but I think more fundamentally because it proved a disconnect within the national polities between urban centers in which you have a lot of high-income groups, but with high levels of debt and high levels that are and low levels of wealth that have more in common between other urban groups around the world. And their hinterlands, which are actually oftentimes have more savings but less income and have less connections. So the question I think we're getting to in this isn't necessarily how to govern money, but how to govern post-territorial capitalism, or if, and coming back to the question of class, who the new revolutionary class is. Is it those people that are detached from the systems of control we have now, which are principally based around an idea of territoriality, which might not be working anymore? And that's the problem, maybe not of necessarily money, but there's a saying, you know, amongst criminal groups, plata or plomo, which I think sums up the politics of money very well, is either you accept a social settlement through payment or you accept it through violence. And I think the problem might be that we're getting to the edge of what money can do, and we're getting to a point where we need to renegotiate sovereignty. And that, unfortunately, might not happen without the other end of the coercive scale. Mm-hmm. Because this is a problem of sovereignty, not a problem of money.
Thanks. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. Why don't you all take a minute if you have any last thoughts about this conversation, and so everyone on the panel can take.
We'll just go down the line.
We can do it down the line, or you can go first.
I just want to speak really quickly to questions of coercion and violence and the threat of violence. I concur that the history of money is a history of coercion and violence, but I don't think that's the last thing or the first thing that ought to be said about money. And I think one of the things that so excites me about Chris's work and the work of the neo-chartalists and their fellow travelers is that while they reckon with power and power as backed by the threat of and monopoly on violence, I don't think that's all that's going on. And I think that there is a returning to money as a not neutral, but as a mode of collective provisioning. That even if it feels really rotten and crisis-ridden right this second, doesn't mean that it necessarily is. So I would sort of push back against, let's say, certain Marxist tendencies to equate the money relation with universal alienation and contradiction and crisis, and kind of repeating this oft-told moral fall story. So again, that doesn't mean money is neutral in any way, but I think that it brings us back to the question of collective provisioning, which is always open, it's always riddling, it's always difficult, and it involves conflict. But that's a different way of putting it. And I would say, if anything grounds us now, it's not necessarily violence, it's our collective interdependence, both social and ecological. And we can have, within this country, between countries, we can have heterogeneous and conflicting desires, points of view, answers to the problems, but we're not disconnected. We're not just warring parties inflicting or threatening to inflict violence upon one another. And to me, that's, in my own work, where I try to sort of reopen the conversation around money. So that'll be my last remark.
Okay.
I would just say that it strikes me at this conference if money is a set of relationships, then one question the conference poses is what is the place of that set of relationships, the relationships attached to the creation and distribution of the means of payment, to capitalism more broadly. And my own sense is that in earlier understanding of capitalism that focused narrowly but also sharply on the employment relation, neglected the monetary relation, neglected what one might call it an environmental relation in terms of commodification of natural resources. So it seems to me that it's valuable for us to think about what our understanding of capitalism renders visible. And my sense at the conference and in general is that the thinking of capitalism in terms of financialization and capitalization as we do now renders certain kinds of power and resistance visible and central, but it renders other kinds of power and resistance less visible, and it means that even when we attend, for example, to labor, we often attend to it in its guise as human capital, which I think is part of the reason why slavery we have a new understanding of slavery that's come out of the new history of capitalism. Harder to see what the new understanding of wage labor is. So that's what.
So we're officially out of time, should we?
So I'm just going to very briefly say, I mean, Scott gave me a great platform on which to say, the work that I have done has all been in the service of trying to de-reify money, to understand that it's a complicated institution that can mobilize for many reasons, and the same is true of the market. And it's not like the market or money are matters of degree. So this is the account that I read again and again and was just really disagreed with, that capitalism is some kind of thickening of markets until it's all markets and no humanity. I think the market, we need to take back the market, right? To de-reify the market, de-reify money, and think about what these institutions are and what we want to do with them.
Okay.
I just want to say, I've attended now several conferences in this law school that Chris and her colleagues have organized. I've never failed to learn from them. In fact, I think it's fair to say I've learned more from these conferences than any other conferences I've gone to. This is no exception, and I want to add my thanks to the thanks of everybody here for your work.
All I want to do is thank Chris for putting this together. Really, I have nothing else to say apart from just thanking her for making this possible. It's an absolute dream. You deserve a lot of thanks for this.
Thank you all.